Hello everybody, welcome to this Climate Now live event here at Euronews headquarters in Brussels. We have a live audience in front of us, a fabulous range of guests here as well, and thanks for joining online. Today we are talking about how climate data is shaping EU policy, how are the facts about how our planet is changing actually feeding into the system here in Brussels. Let me introduce our guests, Delara Burkhardt, MEP from the Socialists and Democrats groups. Thank you very much for being with us. Next to you is Florence Rabier, Director General of ECMWF, the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasts. And we have Michal, who is an MEP from the Renew Europe group. Thanks for being here. And Vicky Pollard, who's the head of unit at the European Commission's Directorate General for Climate Action. Great to have you here. I hope we have a great discussion. We're also going to be taking questions from the audience online. Thank you for those, and also from the audience here. Firstly, a few facts about how our planet is changing. It is changing rapidly. As you know, the latest figures will give us an estimation that this year CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere will go up to 423 parts per million, which, if that means nothing to you, just keep in mind that when I was an awkward little baby, according to my mother, 50 years ago, we had 330 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. It keeps going up every year. That's the reason our planet is warming, because of these emissions into the atmosphere. We had the hottest summer on record in Europe this year. Last year was the warmest on record. We have seen these wildfires in Portugal, floods in Central and Eastern Europe. We've seen heat waves in Italy and Balkans. And that's just in Europe this year. We saw all of that extreme rain as well. All of those bits of data are coming to us as journalists all of the time, but we also know that here in Brussels, you have a lot of lobbyists, people who are coming along and giving you information as MEPs, telling you stories, telling you about situations, sometimes perhaps biased, sometimes filtered, sometimes pointing in a particular direction. And I think that's going to be one of the things we talk about today. Delara, I wanted to come to you quickly on that point. How often are you approached by lobbyists talking to you about these issues in your daily work? Is it every hour, every day, or every week?
It's of course a lot, and I always try to put it in a different perspective, because lobbyism in the first place means representing an interest, and a lobbyist is a NGO, is a company, so every interaction actually we have as politicians, not among each other, is kind of a lobby interaction. So of course this is a basic thing we do as members of parliament, but I know that you're not referring to this meta level. Well, the reason why there are so many lobbyists in Brussels is obviously because the parliament is making a lot of decisions, and it's a little bit a proof of the importance of the parliament in the legislative process of EU, that there are a lot of different lobbyists coming to us and perceiving their perspectives. But what I consider to be problematic in the 5 years now, to make it concrete, for example, when I was the rapporteur of the packaging and packaging waste regulation, that there's a misrepresentation on who has access to actually influence political decision makers. There is a big growing number of different industry-sided lobbyists that have a huge impact on the debates in Brussels. And for example, when it comes to packaging, the consumer perspective was represented very, very low. And I found this problematic because every kindergarten child, the first contact you have with environmental question is the question how we treat our waste, how we can reduce our waste.
For sure.
So there's a misrepresentation in that, and this is a problem, I think.
Michal, can I come to you and ask your experience then of lobbying?
Yeah, I would heavily agree with Delara. Like, the lobbying is the part of the business, everyday part of the business.
A legitimate part of the business.
And legitimate, exactly. Usually a legitimate. I was dealing with Industrial Emission Directive, which is a complex and huge issue, very, very broad. And for me, it was really necessary to meet the people from the industries, from the different sectors, to present their viewpoint on these proposals, you know, and to really understand what their concerns are. So this is the part of the lobbying that I actually very much welcome and exploit in many ways. The trick is actually that you, as an MEP, have the possibility to select which lobbyist you actually meet that might shed a little bit of light of the subjectiveness of this process. And as well, you as an MEP, as a good MEP, might be able to filter which lobbyist actually provides you with solid data and solid insight, and which tries to navigate you somewhere and maybe bias, you know.
I might expect some more audience would like to find out a bit more about that, how you're doing your filtering. Yeah, but we'll come back to lobbying. Vicky, you're in that building. We can see out the window here. You can't see it online, but the European Commission building is there. It's a big, imposing building. It looks like a kind of fortress. Surely the lobbyists can't get in there and force their ideas on you, or do they?
So I think from the Commission's perspective, we're interested in engaging in anybody who's willing to embark on the transition to climate neutrality. For us, when we do our everyday work, for example, on the 2040 impact assessment for the 2040 target recommendation, we have an open process. We have a better regulation guidelines, we have the Have Your Say platform, and we have an open call for evidence. It's important that we engage individuals and organizations, and that's really an opportunity for everybody to have their say.
But there you're hearing also, not just from industry lobbies and things, but you're also hearing from climate scientists. I'm guessing you're hearing from organizations like Copernicus, or for example, yeah. Let me go to Florence. What's the role of something like ECMWF or Copernicus in this ecosystem?
Sure. So ECMWF is operating on behalf of the EU, two of the Copernicus services, the Climate Change Service and the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Services. So what we are doing is providing science-based facts. So we are really doing unbiased information based on the latest science and technology. And we are benefiting from the huge investment that the EU has put in the last 20 years or so in Copernicus, in satellites and in technology, in science, to deliver information on the past climate. We go back to 1940 and provide an image of how the climate has changed. We also put together the projections and tools to examine what the projections will be. So I think these can all be used as a reference.
Kind of trusted source.
Exactly, authoritative information.
Michal, we now have a new parliament. We have new colleagues coming in here as well. Is it your experience from the people that you've met in the corridors here that these are people who are ready to listen to data, as we're talking about?
Well, I hope for that. What I have noticed is actually that the current parliament is less green compared to the previous one. That's for sure. Yeah. The composition, you know, the setup of the individual groups has changed and shifted a little bit towards far right, which is not a good news in general. So yeah, we will.
Do you mean politically green, or do you mean open to the question of how we're going to deal with the climate?
I would say green in regards to green ambitions, to environmental ambitions. It seems that the narrative that these groups actually were using during the elections was a little bit against the Green Deal direction that was already set in the previous mandate. So I'm quite curious about the outcome. I hope that we can stick to the policy that is driven by facts and by science, with its limitations, you know, of course. But yeah, we will see. I'm very much curious about
Delara, what's your feeling?
I have always a little bit of optimism in me, but I think the facts are very clear that a lot of the far right parties, but also reaching into the middle, they have been campaigning with the anti-Green Deal campaign. They were criticizing the green ambition of the last commission. And we already saw in the first debates, for example, on the floods we had in the Strasbourg plenary, that there is more climate denial going on in the debates, where it's said that it's not the climate change, it's weather always has been changing, and this floods always extreme weather events always happened. So there is a denial.
You hear that being said out loud?
Yeah. We hear that it's being said out loud. I'm actually right now preparing a reel, making a little bit some proofs of that, because we see it, it's growing, and it's a problem for a fact-based debate we have to have as legislators.
How does it make you feel, Florence, to hear that that's still there? I mean, how many decades is it that we've had climate scientists telling us this?
Yeah, and we can document. There were some records broken, for instance, in Austria with the at least 12 weather stations recording more than 300 millimeters of rain in a few days, sometimes more than 400. We know that this is at least twice the records that have been on these stations. So saying it has always rained, yes, but we are really building records now of the amount of
Absolutely.
rain. Yeah.
But I mean, imagine you're face to face with one of these politicians, and just so everybody knows, actually, as well in the audience, in terms of who we all contacted to join this panel, all of the groups that are represented have a large representation in the Parliament. I did speak to them and invite them to come along to it. Some of them didn't ever get back to me. But if you're face to face with somebody who's saying that, who's an elected representative, what do you do? What would you show them?
Well, we have a lot of tools, and we have some interactive tools where you can actually explore the past climate. So we are also working on making it easier to actually replace one extreme event in the past and in the future. So for the time being, we are more providing statistics, how the temperature and the precipitation have changed, etc. But because these extreme events are quite striking, and this is what affects millions of people, we are actually working on something new that will be replacing extreme events in the past and in the future to better communicate these things.
Yeah, because that's something I really want to talk about, is how do we communicate the science to the politicians, and are we getting that right? But Vicky, what's your experience inside the Commission in terms of the flow of information? Can you just tell us a bit about the sources of information that you're using, the climate data sources that you're using when you're coming up with your proposals?
So first of all, our work is based on the work of the IPCC. So the IPCC is fundamental in determining what's happening to the climate, what we need to contribute, the options we have, and we use that as the basis for our modelling work. We also invest very heavily in science. So through our research programs, we actually make sure that we're investing in the science of the future. So understanding how the climate works, understanding the impacts of climate change on different parts of society, on natural systems, but also investing in the science which is leading to the options for responding. So policies, but also technologies.
And then how do you decide what it is that you're going to be investing in there?
So we listen to the scientists. So I think there's a very big process of review. I have colleagues in the room who are involved in this, and with DG, RTD.
You literally invite them in for meetings and have a discussion.
There's this discussions with stakeholders who are scientists who engage with us on where the gaps are. We listen, for example, to the IPCC authors on where the points where we need more information.
But we've got a lot of operational data, right? We've got terabytes worth of information coming down from satellites, from in situ, all of the time. Is that kind of operational data being used as well as the sort of maybe more fundamental science questions that you might have, or the IPCC reports which come out every few years or so, right? It's a long time between each one.
So the data, the satellite imaging is very important in terms of communication. So I think the Copernicus reports and others are very important in terms of people really getting a feel for what the data means. It's a much clearer way to see things. But it's also
you mean like visualization?
Real visualization.
This bit is red, so that must mean it was hotter, kind of stuff. Okay. Yeah.
And that's important because it's a very fast way to assimilate information, but it's also very important in terms of the early warning systems. It's very important in terms of understanding adaptation. Everything which is land-based, at the moment, the satellite data is tremendously important. So when we're looking at land use change, forestry, areas where we need to reduce emissions, but also where we need to absorb more CO2. There we can see devise policies with compliance mechanisms using the data so that we can target better and we can see whether things are happening on the ground and whether they're successful. That's
super interesting, especially as well related to ecosystems and their responses at the moment, which I know Michal is keen on that. Let's open it up to the floor if anybody would like to ask a question already in this conversation. Please raise your hand, and we've got somebody with a microphone who can come over already. Okay, and please tell us your name and tell us your job.
Thanks. I'm Megan Richards. I'm right now a senior advisor with Ruud Peterson, which is public affairs consulting with only a few days a month. But I wanted to ask you a question particularly about, there's masses of information, there's masses of data, and it's really very important to know it and to have access to it. But you know very well how much it is. How are you going to make it clear, not just to policymakers, but to the public, what the impact is, how to translate this huge amount of information to them and show them what the impact is, not just of climate data, but what the impact of EU legislation is, which is really important too, I think.
Who fancies answering that one?
Well, maybe I can start. So with Copernicus, we have our data is open and free, so we don't just produce report. We also have these interactive tools where you can navigate these IPCC projections, and you can really look at your country or your region and see what would it look like in one of the scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions.
This is the climate atlas, right?
This is the climate atlas.
Yep.
Yeah, it's an interactive climate atlas. Or what would it look like in a +3 degrees or +4 degrees? And recently we've also have a new tool, which is Climate Pulse, that really gives you real-time information of where we are. Like today was warmer by 1 degree compared to pre-industrial times or things like that. So these are these communication tools. I think sometimes we probably need to go a bit beyond and look at the impacts as well. And maybe that's something that, at least from us, might be missing. We are, for instance, investigating at the moment, not just the temperature, but the heat stress. As we know, as bodies, as humans, we are subject to temperature and we overheat sometimes, not only because of the temperature, but it also depends on the humidity, on the wind. And there are some indicators that take all that into account, because we need to sweat it off, the heat that we ingest.
And if you can get that kind of things to people, then
exactly.
Yeah, it's much more actionable, isn't it?
Absolutely. Like in the Southeast Europe, the last summer has been really hot, and we can show that more than half of the days were above the strong heat stress limit. So maybe these sort of things is more illustrative of the impact on society.
What would you say for the two MEPs? What are the concerns that you get from your constituents, people who are voting for you, when they talk about climate change? What are they saying?
I don't think that the problem is the lack of knowledge about the urgency of the crisis. It's maybe a little bit the overlapping crises we are seeing, and the feeling of feeling overwhelmed and not knowing what a climate neutral society will mean for your daily life. I think on the one hand, I think it's about the question how we do impact assessments before we have the legislative process, but I think it's also about data we have lacking, especially when it comes to the social consequences on the ground. We don't have so much data there. IPCC started it now with the food security question, but I think this is really the crucial problem, that people with the legislations we are making in Brussels cannot really feel what they will mean in their daily life.
Yeah, what's it mean for me?
Change.
Actually, that ties into one of the questions we had online, and thank you for sending questions in. Tom is asking us, and this is the kind of question I get asked as well, aside from recycling our waste and conserving energy and so on in our homes, what's the best and most effective way that ordinary people can make a difference? What do you say to somebody in that situation? What do you say to them?
I mean, I think this is a little bit the problem, that we right now are shaping policies to make it a burden of anyone else, that everyone has on their shoulders to get along in a climate neutral society. And this is a problem where I always say, make politicians you vote for accountable for making you being part of the transformation. I think this is a crucial problem. And when we talk, for example, about the ETS2, where we talk about very sensitive issues about the heating, the transportation, things that will change in every people's life, and they have to have access to the sustainable alternatives. When you see prices climb, and your wage is not climbing, you get worried about what this will mean for your future.
For sure, absolutely. Michal, can I get your experience when you're speaking to people? You're from Slovakia. What happens there? What are the conversations like?
Maybe I would like to stress that there's still a lot of denial in the field. There's still a lot of.
You mean from voters that you meet?
From public, from politicians, everywhere, on every level, there's still a lot of denial, who don't think that the current situation is actually serious, or that is something that is human-driven. And then, I think that reality is very helping in this regard. Even it sounds really, really strange, but...
No, but the kind of shock, the physical shock of this happened where I live.
Yeah. The shock is also the part of the package. But if you recall, in 2019, EP was able to declare climate emergency, and we declared that there's climate crisis going on. Yep. A lot of people were not believing that, and I think that the number of people who deny that fact is actually lower after these floods, after these droughts, after these heat waves. We are experiencing climate crisis. So, in my perspective, it is very good to be not only reactive, but to be proactive.
But
And
do
that's
you
the
come to
main
them?
goal.
Do you come to them if you're talking, for example, with constituents, with people who are voting for you or not? Do you actually confront them with data and facts and say, sea level rise is rising at 4.4 millimeters per year now, and it's accelerating, and that is a problem, not in Slovakia necessarily, but elsewhere in the world, it's a problem, for example, or heat waves of, do you talk to them about that, or do you use other kinds of arguments?
It depends on the partner in the discussion, or in the debate. Someone are actually willing to embrace the data and to reflect them. Some will deny.
So you judge the person.
What can you do? What can you do? Someone is really, how to say, immune to data. They have their beliefs and they will go on. The only solution for that is really to be persistent and to wait. They will experience for their own, on their own skin how far from reality they were. But I think this is not the really appropriate strategy. We need to be proactive in order to prevent the worst effects that will come in the future.
There was a lot of calls last week in Strasbourg in that debate for adaptation. Were those resonating and heard wider than that? Were actually, inside the Commission, for example, what's the view on adaptation law, which is what some of the politicians are calling for?
So in the Commission, we've sponsored the EEA's first EU climate risk assessment, which is a very important exercise, which looks at how the risks we face, where we have the room to address those risks, and allows us to plan better for the future. It's very clear that we need to be prepared. We're not prepared for the climate change which is to come, and we need to really up our game in terms of preparing for not the climate that we have now, but the climate which will inevitably come, even if we take action to be in 1.5 degrees world.
That message seems to have failed to have passed.
Yeah.
Why?
I think it's you think it's failed to pass? I think it's.
So, yeah.
I think it's a message.
The climate you've got now is not the result of the emissions today. The climate you've got now is the result of emissions decades ago. It's a very, very slow reaction in the system. And that whatever happens, even if we stopped everything tomorrow, it's going to carry on getting warmer for a while.
I think it's a lack of understanding of science. I think it's also, we live in the world now, we're concerned about the world now. So I think what we do need is to look at what was in the communication from the Commission on being prepared, looking at how we can plan better, and we're looking at European climate adaptation plan to come with the new Commission. Assessing the need for legislation, it's in the mission letters to our Commissioner. I think it's important to look at where there are risk owners, those people who can make a difference, and making sure that the opportunities to take the climate risks into account in everything we do, in all the different funds we have, in the actions we take, is done in a coordinated way, because we need to be coordinated to act faster.
Florence, what would you say coming from a scientific organisation that needs to be in an adaptation law? What sorts of things need to be included or thought about before you start drawing that up?
Already, I think in terms of Europe, we can already adapt to the extreme events that are happening now. And this is where Europe has been really good with the emergency management service in particular, managed by the JRC, that you can see that Europe being put together can do this rapid response, like for instance for the fires in Portugal. And these are events that happen because of climate change. And so, okay, it's not adaptation in the long term, but the response of Europe of being united and trying to help each other and to respond in this. And
but there's a big debate in Portugal at the moment about how do we adapt? What is it we've been doing? Why have we got this problem?
Sure.
They haven't really got a solution at the moment.
No, it's difficult to get solutions. There is a new initiative in the Commission as well, which is called Destination Earth, or Destiny in short, which is going to provide more operational climate projections. The IPCC are very rigorous in the whole range of projections, but they come every 6-7 years, for instance. But with Destination Earth, it could create more operational
digital twin, right?
The digital twin. Yeah. Why is it called? And it's not just projections with scenarios. It's digital twins, so sort of digital replica of the atmosphere, of the climate, that are at high resolution. So the resolution that is needed to adapt to it, but also when you can test some what-if scenarios. So you can replay some simulations, we're saying, what if we plant trees? What if we do this with reservoirs, etc.? So I think this can also maybe is a useful tool to sort of say what could we do and what effects it would have in a sort of simulation way.
Would that be a tool for all of us to use? Is it a tool for policymakers, a tool for journalists?
For the time being, it just started a couple of years ago. We've just done the first climate simulations, and it's going to open gradually, and it will be open in particular for policymakers, but there will be some data available to all as well.
Let's go to questions again. Would you like to just stand up and tell us your name, tell us your job, and ask your question, please? We'll see if the camera can pick you up. If you move a little bit that way, then we'll be able to get you in the picture, and the people watching online can see you. There you are.
Picture okay?
There you are. Very good.
My name is Nicholas Jensen. I work for TESS, Tree Energy Solutions. We're an e-methane, renewable e-methane project developer. And my question is on the 2040 targets. So kind of the next part, I guess, of the discussion that's going to come up with adaptation. And the question is, in a sense, quite simple, and I expect fairly complicated. Is climate data going to be enough to convince people of what we need to do towards 2040, particularly considering the Draghi reports and some of the takeaways in terms of competitiveness that we're going to have to tackle? Thank you.
That's a good question. Vicky, I think that one was for you, wasn't it?
I think the climate data is the basis for explaining what's happening, and our climate data is much broader than the physical climate data. And when we look at the 2040 impact assessment, we look very broadly. So we look at a number of things. We look at the climate impacts, the cost of not acting, so where we will be if we don't act, because that's what we really need to know as the baseline for our actions. But we also look at what it means in terms of the cost of the technologies, the investment needed, but also what it means if we don't act in terms of what we need in terms of having an energy system which functions, which allows our economy to keep thriving. And we need investment in the energy system. We know that for the stability of the EU, we need to have clean, reliable sources. We need to make sure that as much as possible, the investment in those energy sources stays within the EU. The amount that we spend on importing fossil fuels at the moment is huge, and it exposes our economies to a lot of risks. So there is, when we talk about climate data, it's a much broader set of data, and we're doing a lot of work through climate science also on the socio-economic aspects, and making that much more available, much more visible, so that people can find the elements which are relevant to their particular concerns, their particular activity.
But you're talking a lot about then the cost of inaction.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what, if you were to be faced with somebody who's a bit cynical about this and the investment needed, then you talk about the cost of inaction, yes. Right? Do we have good ways of talking about that, actually, from a scientific point of view, Florence?
Yes, we can see what will the future be if we don't act, for sure. I mean, the costs, we are not, at least at ECMWF, dealing with the cost of it, but we can see the consequences in terms of the physical parameters, and then these can be translated in terms of disasters and costs in general.
Michal,
the cost of inaction is actually survival. That's how it is, you know, and that's how grim it is. If we don't do proper things, then our survival is at stake. That's the essence of the climate crisis we're experiencing. Coming back to that question.
But it all sounds a bit scary if you say that, doesn't it?
But that's the reality, you know. We have to scare people. Okay, let's do it. If we achieve, you know, proper steps after that, let's do it. But it's not scaring them. It's actually talking about the reality and what the outcome will be if we don't do.
I think, I mean, having played around with the climate atlas that you've got, it is interesting because you can look at different emission scenarios and say, which one are we on? You know, RCP 8.5, whatever. I mean, all kind of gets a bit technical, but you can play around with your disaster movie scenarios and say, well, where I live in Europe, it's going to be X degrees warmer when I'm 80 years old, and that doesn't sound very nice at all. What am I going to do? Where am I going to live? It sounds, Go on, sorry.
You know, the perspective is very, very, very useful, actually, because right now we experience record-breaking floods, record-breaking rainfall, record-breaking heat waves. Just imagine what the situation will be in 10 years, not far from here.
Not even imagine, though. Let's actually look at the facts. Sorry, Delara.
No, I mean, I think this is a problem about the communication side. We skipped this part, but of this panic mode and the records, it didn't mobilize. It mobilized a youth movement that came and changed, lead the paths to the Green Deal, I would say. But now we are in a different situation. People feel overburdened by this. So I think what is crucial also to come back to the question is to actually deliver on the targets we set by making it possible to have access to the climate solutions, because we see with the right implementation, and this is what we have to do now, of the Green Deal, we can overachieve the targets we set for 2030. And we actually know which sectors are not delivering to make us reach 2040 targets. We know it's transport, agriculture, heating, housing. So we know where the deficits are, and we have to look in the sectors and make ready a fit for 2040 target in order to reach this goals. So I think it's about actually delivering and not talking only about that it's urgent, but it's about urgent action that is needed.
If there's any other questions from the audience, please let me know, put your hand up. When we're talking about monitoring, as you say, what is the monitoring that's going on at the moment when it comes to emissions? Is anybody actually doing any proper monitoring of emissions where we're actually counting that everybody's actually emitting what they say they're emitting?
Well, there are these nationally determined contributions of where countries determine their emissions. But it's coming late because you have to centralize everything that's coming from every sectors. And it's only based on some assumptions, some hypotheses of what they are emitting. Now, from satellites, the great thing is that you can observe CO2, you can observe methane as well. But you can only observe at the moment concentration, so the result of everything that is in the atmosphere. You can also, with Copernicus, we estimate the fluxes, so what is emitted, and the sinks as well. But because they are natural processes, it's not just the emissions. The resulting of everything that is in the atmosphere is the resulting of natural processes and a bit of the emissions. So this, we have to progress on that, and actually the Commission has set up this Copernicus program with a new aspect of it, which is the CO2 monitoring and verification support system, with new satellites that will be launched.
That's your new satellite that's going to go in
CO2M 2026.
2026, you're going to launch that?
Yeah. So in 2027, we might be able to better disentangle what is coming from natural sources and what are the emissions. But for this, we need satellites, but we need also the whole understanding of the Earth system, because we need also to know the processes. And I think this will be really super important to help people actually adjust maybe their emissions, their nationally determined
So country X can actually look and say, well, actually our figures are way off. We really weren't calculating it properly, possibly because of ecosystem changes as well. Michal, I know you're particularly interested in biodiversity and those sorts of issues. Do you feel that is kind of underestimated or not taken, underrepresented?
Yeah, the ecosystems in general are very much underestimated in the equations. I'm pretty much sure about that. We can see it actually from the situation in 2020 when there was this COVID outbreak. There was a huge drop in economic activities, and the emissions still were on the rise. There was no drop recorded in the total emissions, despite the industries were really low in that year. So where did the emissions come from? They were coming probably from the huge fires in the Amazon basin and in the Siberia. So again, the biodiversity issues were also involved in this pattern. And I think a lot of reluctance in the decision-making process actually to encompass this issue properly and to really set it in the equations in order to be actually assessing the problem accordingly.
Reluctance because they don't want to face facts, do you think?
It's not only that, it's about the interest. When it's related to forestry, it's always a problem to negotiate some sort of ambitious position. This is how it goes. So this is really a hard job to actually move from the current situation, the status quo, especially when related to agriculture, forestry, fishery. This is something that is really, really tough to break.
Do you agree with that? This concept of reluctance to kind of face facts on that and to see those things and take them on board?
I agree. I think there are a lot of different examples for that too. I mean, the e-fuels debate, the nuclear debate, where if we would put the cost efficiency on the table, we would have clear data what is the urgent thing we could do. So there is reluctance because on other things, on technology-based solutions, there is more economic interest, hence where we come to the beginning when we talked about lobbying, so more public and more lobbying on these issues, and the trees don't have so many lobbies that come up and say.
But they must have some kind of lobby. So people have told me that the forestry lobby is actually very strong. The agriculture lobby is very strong. What are they saying to you, Michal?
That we don't need a change in the way
everything's fine. Leave us alone.
Delivered and have been delivering for decades. Everything is fine. We have more forest than ever, but don't ask about the quality of the forest, or the resilience or the biodiversity involved, So it's not a good debate. It's not a discussion, not at all. So we really have to find a way how to overcome this resistance, and it's not easy in the plenary. It's not easy in the commission. It's not easy in the field. But it needs to be tackled. Otherwise, the forest will collapse in maybe 2 or 3 decades.
What's behind that for you?
Timber, biomass,
it's money,
and interests, and bioeconomy. Like these things are heavily involved in this bias discussion.
Yeah, Vicky, I see you nodding as well. Give us your thoughts.
I think it's clear that there's many different demands on the land and forests. Both, because they're an important sink, because they're an important source of the activity that's going now, but also materials for the future. So, and with the biofuels and other debates, so it's clear that there's a lot of tension, and it's important that we.
And people will be looking to you for a plan. Do you have one?
So we're working. So at the moment, we've come out with a 2040 recommendation and a communication around the 2040 target. We have,
which is the target is.
So 90% net greenhouse gas emissions reduction relative to 1990 levels by 2040, which is what's necessary to put us on the path to 2050, but also to ensure that we get the best for the European economy in terms of being a leader, in terms of green technologies, in terms of cutting our fossil fuel import costs, and the broader health benefits that come from actually front-loading some of the action to the first decade rather than the second.
I'd be interested to hear if anybody in the audience thinks the 2040 target is realistic and impossible. Would you like to ask a question? We've got a question here. Oh, okay. It's fine. Yeah, go on.
Thank you very much. I'm Denis Bonvillain. I represent Veolia in Brussels. I'm a lobbyist, actually. So Veolia provides solutions and services when it comes to water, waste, and energy management for cities and industries. I'd like to bring in another topic. We've been talking a lot about emissions, but I'd like to talk about water, because you know that it's a key element also of climate and climate change, especially the adaptation part. So I'm turning to you to know if you have instruments also to monitor live water quantities in Europe. I know that some member states do have this kind of live monitoring, like France, for example, for the aquifer level.
So kind of like a water budget.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's a question to you, because, I mean, someone could say, could we not prevent extreme episodes like the floods that just happened in Central Europe? With the weather forecast, can we not just prevent and try to avoid anticipate and avoid these dramatic events?
Okay, yeah.
And my second question is to DG Klima. The President von der Leyen announced a water resilience strategy, which we very much welcome, actually. So who's going to be in charge? Because for us, it's very much.
He's a lobbyist. He wants to know who to phone up.
No, it's
who to meet for lunch.
For us, it's very much a priority. Equally to CO2, to climate. So water should be super high on the agenda, and it's not just for DG Environment to be in charge. It should involve everybody in the Commission, actually. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Two questions then. So
in terms of water, for instance, we are the computational center for the flood awareness system of the Emergency Management Service, so run by the JRC. So we are using the precipitation coming from different centers, actually from ECMWF, but also from the German Weather Service. And we are running these simulations of what the the flow will be in the rivers and what the inundation will be. So that, of course, is done at the global scale as well and at the European scale. So we can provide this data. This is very important in particular for big rivers that come through several countries. And so then we provide this information to the agencies in the different countries that are responsible for water management, and then they can refine that. They can use this information on top of the tools they have.
But is that information currently used reactively or maybe post-event rather
no,
than
it's
the kind
using
of
in
early warning?
it's used in real time.
And
we
for
provide
prevention
some
as well?
warnings, etc.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So they know a couple of days ahead.
A few days ahead, we can go up to 10 days. We also run them for the season.
Right.
So projections for the season, which of course are not so accurate as for the next few days. So this is something done at the European scale, which of course then can be managed by the local.
And then it comes down to member states, of
exactly,
course, to act on the information or not, which is, of course, what fed into a lot of the debates about what happened in Germany a few years ago. Vicky, would you like to answer the other question?
So on water resilience is clearly an important issue. It's been raised in the mission letters. I think everyone can read the mission letters in detail to see, but basically on the DG Environment, I think they would be in the lead, but it's clear that the new structure is really about working between the different portfolios, so for the different commissioners and EVPs working together, but also obviously across the DGs. Teresa Rabier, as EVP designate, has a strong coordinating role, but it's clear that it's going to be bringing together many different aspects to get a good plan.
I want to bring in another question we had online from Rakesh Vazirani. Thank you for sending questions to us. Climate data is also livelihood data, he says. It's lives lost data, national security data, international assistance data. Can you share plans to upskill policymakers and politicians about this new paradigm? That it's not just climate data, which sounds a bit cold. This is people.
I'm, as I said, very much in favor of that, because I think it's a communication side of it, but also we have to make sure that politicians see the necessity of actually dealing with this data. Because
how would you engage them? Imagine you've got somebody from the right-hand side of the political column. You're sitting next to him on the bus on your way to COP, and he's saying, "Oh, this is a load of nonsense," and you say, "No, what about this?"
What I could actually need, and I'm happy that there's now a think tank in Berlin who's actually doing it, breaking it down to personal, individual destinies. So there's a think tank in Berlin called Sozial-Klimarat, Social Climate Council, who developed personas, 17 different personas who represent average people in the German society based on their income, based on their demands of energy, the house they own, or if they rent, etc., which car they drive, etc., to make sure and to design how actually climate policies affect their daily life. Yep. And I think data like this is super useful to get more in the debate on actually also stopping the fears that are thrown out by the right, because they don't, the climate deniers, they don't work with facts. They work with fears by making people scared about not having a place in the future.
Some of the climate campaigning is also about fear as well. I mean, what Michal was talking about earlier is that fear can sometimes be an important weapon. We saw it at least with, or as a certain way to make society move. It certainly happened with the financial crisis and with COVID. But when it comes to the communication of science data, Michal, how would you improve it? This sounds like a great way of doing it, making it personal.
Well, I'm being around for 5 years in the parliament, and my experience is that the parliament listens best to protests and crises. You know, so that's when something is changing, something is moving. Otherwise, we are very much, sedentary and trying not to move from the place. And then if
do you mean protests outside the European Parliament? Because that seems to happen every day.
Or in the capital. Like the farmers' protest, for instance.
Yeah,
they were a huge moving force, actually, and the protests for the Climate for Future, or Fridays for Future, 5 years ago, they were always also very much shaping the EU policy for next 5 days. So these kind of protests are really helping, or not, depends on the essence of the protest. And then the crises that we have to face and we have to react on, they are also, but we are again in this setup of being reactive, not proactive. That is not a good policy. And if you ask me whether it's good to provide the member of the parliament with more and more data and solid data, we have all the data that we need. We have Joint Research Center. you know, and we don't listen to it. Like there have been many cases.
But
where
is the Joint Research Centre or Copernicus or the World Meteorological Organization or the IPCC, are they talking to those people in a language they can understand?
Of course, but it's not only about facts. If we would be really fact-driven facility, then you will see the outcome that will be super effective, you know, very fast. But it's not about that. The policy is also about interests, about different viewpoints, about different standpoints, and you get this cocktail where you are not that effective at the end of the decision-making process. But that is democracy, you know. So, but I'm pretty much sure that we don't listen to the science as much as we could have listen to. The JRC and the biomass issues were a very good example of that, where Parliament simply ignored the advices of the JRC regarding the RED 2, you know, and went completely different way. The biomass is
was that lobbyists coming in and saying, actually, guys, you know, it's not that bad?
like the biggest lobbyists are inside of the groups, you know, political groups themselves. So if they're protecting, defending some sort of interest, and they are mighty within the Parliament, you know, you won't move too much. So it's like that, you know. That's the play, or that's the game we play. That's the cards we are dealt with, and we have to find out the way how to improve the situation as much as possible. You know, it's not always exhaustive. Yeah.
Sounds a bit like school, doesn't it? Really, it's always infighting these different groups. When we've got another COP coming up in Azerbaijan, we have also got NDCs that need to be declared for next year. Are we seeing already kind of a lobbying around those things? At the moment, Delara, are you experiencing that?
I mean, the last COP was led by a lobbyist, so of course there's a lot of influence and there's a lot of talks around that. What I found to be problematic, because data, we always act like data is something neutral that is designed by scientists, but you can buy data, you can make your own studies, you can influence your own studies. So I think this is where we have to just educate lawmakers, or like, it's not about educating. They know when there's a study financed by X epsilon, they know it's in the interest of X epsilon. So I think this is a little bit where we need the public attention, where we need the media to actually show off. And I think it was a little bit too quiet when there was a chef lobbyist negotiating the last COP, and there should have been more
Your team were talking to me about this last week and saying that you receive, you know, kind of, in their words, kind of biased reports, or, you know, not necessarily sort of fake science, but things that are a bit pseudoscience, and you're actually being given those. How does that work? Do they kind of ambush you in the sandwich shop or something and say you should read this? So how does it? Tell us about the examples of how it works.
It's so much money behind it. There are campaigns that are designed to influence. You also know it as a public administration communication official. So actually, when it comes to that, I will give you one concrete example. It was the question of reusable packaging in general, and how single use is supposed to be the more sustainable one due to some studies that were financed by industries who luckily are actually working on and making the money with single-use packaging. So we actually, as lawmakers, were attacked, I would say, in that on a different level. There were poster campaigns when you arrived at Brussels Airport, where where the study was in a very neutral tone presented to the lawmakers arriving in the airport. There were
opinion presented as fact.
Presenters, media advertisers that were bought in order to put it everywhere in the daily life of MEPs. So it was really, really present. And I, with my team, and everyone expects a lawmaker to have like a big team. I have one assistant who was working on it. We were always like writing down fact checks. There was luckily a group of scientists who like make a debunk of this study. Right. But it was hard to go against it when there's so much money invested in a campaign to actually achieve the difference. So we tried to work against it, and I have to admit we lost it because it was just too much advertisement that was paid in order to influence this political decision making. And this is a problem, and this is it should be called out by independent media, and it was, but not enough, I think, because it's not only about industry interests when we shape a packaging law. It's about consumers wanting less packaging in their daily life, and we have to deliver on that as lawmakers and not only defend one side.
Florence, can I bring you in on this then? How would you like to improve this messaging in order to compete at that sort of level? Because it sounds like it's pretty intense. How should the scientific community be mobilizing itself?
Sure, it's not so easy because, as you say, we provide a lot of data, a lot of facts, but we are not necessarily asked questions about what do you think of this and that. I think at the EU there is this scientific advice mechanism with some chief scientific advisors, but they are tasked with big tasks to give some reports. So I think that the interaction maybe should be a bit more not on a daily basis, but a bit more interaction with people who need some advice.
Let's switch over to some of the other technologies that people talk about, which can obviously be distracting, I think, sometimes. Let's talk about some of the mitigation technologies, because they're discussed in the Commission, they're discussed in Parliament, discussed amongst media. We talk about things like carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, trying to take carbon out of the atmosphere. When it comes to those kinds of technologies, Michal, first off, what's your view on them? And do you think they're kind of distracting from the debate about adaptation, which perhaps should be what we should be acting on and spending a lot more money on?
Yeah, I would say so. I think, or I see that there is a strong tendency of the decision-making, responsible for the decision-making, to really be affiliated with the technology stuff, you know, and not with the ecosystem stuff, so to say. So the carbon capture and storage is very favorite among many members of European Parliament, despite they have not been proved to be effective. No, they are very very expensive and not that effective, especially when we consider the volume of carbon that we need to actually deal with.
Yes.
So in this regard, I think that this is really a fancy stuff, and stuff that is really set up within the merits of ordinary thinking of MEPs. You know, it can be sold. You know, it can be subsidized.
It sounds attractive, right?
Yeah,
it sounds
attractive.
like it's
The effect is really
shiny,
questionable.
Yeah.
I was actually doing my assessment of the situation, and I was coming back to the Drax power plant. Probably you are aware with the situation. It's a British power plant that was transformed from coal burning into biomass burning, and they were actually intended to have some CCS installed on their installation, and the outcome should have been 1 ton of CO2 being captured a day. You know, so around 400 tons a year, and their production or their emissions equals to 21 million tons a year. And they were willing to invest 400 million pounds into this technology. So what's the effect? You know, so this is probably the perspective that really needs to be comprehended properly in order to be able to assess the potential of this.
But people can get lost in the numbers on this, and the European Commission thinks about these things. You make studies on geoengineering too, right?
So, well, first of all, I think the most important is that we need to have approaches which reduce the source of the problem, which is the net emissions of greenhouse gases. And I think it's the most fundamental that we keep our focus on that. I think when we're talking about geoengineering, we need to be clear what it is we're talking about. It covers a very wide range of possible technologies. But it's clear that...
Are there particular ones which you are looking at seriously now at the moment and studying whether you think it's going to work or not?
Well, I think there's on solar radiation modification. What we're doing at the moment is, we're listening to what the IPCC says, which says that basically the important or unexpected or undesired or potentially unacceptable risks from the use of solar radiation management, and that we need to be very careful. There's a lot of discussion about its potential. What is happening at the moment is that under the research funds, we fund research to look at regulation of the research into SRM, because this is a global issue. But
it's taken seriously as something we could actually do in order to slow down the rate of warming inside the Commission.
It's part of the debate. It's not something that will slow down the rate of solve the problem in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's what we need to focus on. But it's part of the debate. and because there may be people tempted to go down that route, we need to understand its implications and ensure that we have robust regulation, because it could be applied elsewhere in the world and it could have impacts on the EU.
Florence, can I bring you in on this?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds attractive. You know, you think, okay, we are warming. Well, what if we stopped the incoming radiation from the sun? So why don't we inject some aerosols in the stratosphere? You know, nobody lives in the stratosphere. It's up there. So we inject aerosols, it deflects the sunshine. That's cool. I mean, it sounds so attractive that it needs to be, it's not the method of choice, but it needs to be investigated.
Right.
But for sure, we don't know what it does to the ozone layer. We know that it's not going to counteract some other effects of climate change, because the CO2 will still be there. So like ocean acidification or ecological damage, etc. And we know it will cost a lot, and you probably need to do it for decades, if not centuries, to be effective. So I think it's a good thing to investigate it, the benefits, because it sounds so attractive that it could really distract. But maybe it could be beneficial, but it has to be properly investigated. So I think it's a very good thing from the Commission to do that.
But I have to say that it's something which is getting headlines, but in terms of the funding and the amount of work, the focus is on the technologies and the approaches to reduce our net greenhouse gas emissions, and that's where the bulk of the effort.
As I said, though, at the beginning, I mean, the CO2 that's circling around us now may have been emitted in Brussels, it may have been emitted in Bangladesh. It doesn't really matter. The number for our planet is rising. Can we say that, at least in Europe, any of the efforts that we've been making in the last few years have actually made any difference to the atmosphere, Florence?
Yeah, I think we can say that. We have some numbers to show that the emissions have decreased by more than 30% in the latest numbers. Right. And I think what's great with the Green Deal is that it put also together the pollution and atmospheric composition in pollution with some stringent plans. And because the constituents of pollution are shorter lived, you can see the impact a bit faster as well.
Yep.
And on the other hand, when you work on industry and energy for reducing the emissions of pollutants, there are some co-impacts, because it's usually where also then you might decrease greenhouse gases. So that's a benefit, a co-benefit of this Green Deal.
But overall, though, the number is still going up, right? And we're still going up the same amount that we have been for the last couple of years. It's going like 2 or 3 ppm per year. It keeps rising. Do you have any hope that might start to plateau?
I think what matters is what's happening in the rest of the world. It's clear that EU greenhouse gas emissions, with the latest data, the latest inventory data of 2022, show a 32.5% reduction in the EU. But it's also showing that our policies work. And the EU is a leader globally. We spend a lot of time through a climate diplomacy working with China, India, the major emitters who are the source of the increase in the emissions at the moment. And China is
so you're lobbying them. But
your
lobbying of them doesn't seem to be working especially well.
And I think that, well, if you look at China, China has the largest emissions trading system in the world in terms of greenhouse gas coverage. It's covering the power sector in China.
But will that bring the numbers down? Because the atmosphere doesn't lie. It doesn't tell fibs. It doesn't make stuff up. The numbers are there.
So if at the moment there's an intensity target on the ETS for China, it's quite a tough intensity target. They're looking to change to a cap. So the people we're working with are working on that. They're working at including industries in there, which means that if you cap the emissions as you do in the EU for those the power sector, big industrial emissions, that will make a huge difference to China's greenhouse gas emissions.
And you talk to the Chinese a lot. You used to work there, right? So and you have a bit of faith then that the situation can be improved.
I think China is moving in the right direction. I think it's a question of again, as in Europe, people want to ensure that we can do so in a way which ensures that people's standards of living are protected, and that's where also we have a very intense discussion about what our modelling shows, the policies that we have, so that we can make sure that we have a transition which works for everybody, and that it's good for the Chinese economy too.
We need to wrap things up very soon, but Michal, can I just get your thoughts on how we improve the situation related to the conversation of communicating climate data to politicians? How do we make that better? You said that it's difficult sometimes. I mean, you have a scientific background, you understand all of this, but it's difficult to communicate the climate data and keep this flow of information and make it clear and comprehensible to your colleagues. How do we improve that?
There's a huge advantage that we didn't touch upon, and actually that, you know, this situation is not only about climate and about environment, but it's also about economy, it's also about security, it's also about geopolitics. And these all three aspects or four aspects are embedded in one solution, you know. If you tackle the climate change, you at the same time probably will provide a society with cheap and clean energy, and will get rid of the dependence of imports from Russia, you know, and wherever else, Azerbaijan or whatever we import our fossil stuff from. So this is really a huge advantage that also the industry can reflect on and is already reflecting on. You know, we see a huge increase in renewables all around the globe and in Europe. This definitely has to have an effect in the future. So I think that we are on the good path. It would be really bad if we change that path. And I'm very happy actually about the situation that despite we are now talking about the competitiveness, you know, not so much about the Green Deal is very much embedded into that competitiveness, and it is clear to the decision maker that the competitiveness can be reached only or achieved only if it's being done on the platform of decarbonization and, you know, the renewable energies and all that stuff. So I'm quite
that economic argument can cut through.
Of course, it always counts. You know, the economy will always count. The ecology will prove, you know, and the geopolitics will also stand at the same side, you know. So yeah, I think we are on a good path. In this
Florence, how would you like to, let's say, improve the situation for communicating your science? Because you're generating a lot of data every day, terabytes and terabytes of it, and you want to get it out to people. What would you like to see? What's your dream?
So we provide it, it's open and free, so then people can pick it up and use it. So we can communicate, do bulletins, you know, climate bulletins every month and the big bulletin every year, etc. But providing all these tools that other people can pick up, and in particular this climate pulse, I think, is quite used by journalists to document what's coming at the moment.
Because it's very visual, because you can say what happened. Well, 2 days ago, I can see sea surface temperatures were, you know, 1.8 degrees above average for the time of year compared to the 1991-2020 average or something, and go, my goodness, that's a story there.
But I think working on these extreme events and putting them in the context of the past and the future, that's where we're going as well. And maybe that's talking to people a bit more.
Right. Yeah, it gets granular and individual, which is what you were talking about. Do you think that is actually the storytelling perhaps needs to be improved?
Actually, if I could wish for something, it would be science lobbyists in Brussels, because often I hear that they don't know when the sweet spot is, when you should counteract with parliamentarians in order to make your point. So this would be helpful to know when you should set up your posters at Brussels Airport in order to reach MEPs. So being a little bit more active part, but this goes both sides. I think you're preaching to the choir here. As Michal and me, we are both very science-based politicians, but we have to make sure that the bridges are not so far from each other, and you communicate in your world, we communicate in our worlds, but we have to have the bridges, and there could be there has to be more observation on the communication side of when to actually interfere or to give your comments on current legislation process.
Fascinating.
And if not, then name and shame those who are not responsive to the science. I think that's good too.
Awesome.
Thank
you very much, everybody. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you to Delara Burkhardt, MEP, to Florence Rabier from ECMWF, Michal, Wiezik, MEP, and Vicky Pollard from the European Commission. Thank you, everybody, for being here too. Thank you.
Thank you.